Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to our class on the prophets. I hope you were able to be here last week because we're only going to briefly touch on those things. If you were not able to be here last week, I hope you were able to see it on YouTube at least, where we have it posted. I'm going to run us through just a very quick review of what we covered last week and then move ourselves into talking about the content of these books themselves, or this book itself with its multiple authors. That is one of the first points we made. It appears that there is not just one Isaiah. There was an Isaiah functioning in the 8th century BC in the sort of with the conflicts between the Syrians and the northern kingdom and the Assyrians, all kind of mixed and matched and mashed together, having some major conflict. But that was, again, the 700s BC, probably from about 738 to 701 is that writing. Second Isaiah picks up at chapter 40 of Isaiah, runs through about 40 to about 55, and that Isaiah is dealing with the time of exile. And I should correct it. I switched around a couple of numbers last week. It is 597 that the exile begins, not 579. I just, in talking, screwed those numbers up. But 597 to 539, that's that window. And we'll talk a little more about 2nd Isaiah in a second and what kind of pocket within that time that person was writing. And then 3rd Isaiah seems to be dealing with the return to Jerusalem and the attempts to restore the city and the people to the way they were before the exile. So you would call that post-exile. Again, we'll look a little more closely and specifically at that in a few minutes. But for our purposes as review, 1st Isaiah, 2nd Isaiah, 3rd Isaiah, and then we reviewed some of the historical context for 1st Isaiah. As I said, there's the split between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, Israel and Judah, Ephraim they called them, and also sometimes and then the Syrians are sort of outside the borders there, sometimes also called Aram. We will see that in some of our readings today. The northern kingdom and the Syrians unite together to try to fend off the Assyrians, who are a larger empire coming in. The southern kingdom says, I don't want to be a part of that alliance, so the northern kingdom and Syria turn on their brothers, the people of Judah, and that is, there's a war between them. In order to help gain defense, Judah turns to the Assyrians and says, will you help us out? They say, sure, we'll help you out. They do, but the price they have to pay is that the southern kingdom, Judah, becomes essentially a vassal state of the Assyrians. Fast forward a couple of decades, the Assyrians get a new ruler, and they start encroaching further and further to the west. They overtake the Syrians, they overtake the northern kingdom. The people of Judah, because they are this vassal state, remain okay until the Assyrians have a change in leadership. Hezekiah says, maybe this is our moment to break free from under their thumb, stages a little bit of rebellion, doesn't quite work. Well, it works for a little while, but then the Assyrians get that new king, and they say, there's a price to pay for that. They start eating away at the southern kingdom. Jerusalem remains intact, though, for the time being because they pay this huge penalty, this huge price, keeping Jerusalem whole, but the people severely diminished. So it's in those later conflicts that 1st Isaiah is working. And again, this is sections 1 through 39, chapters 1 through 39 within the 66 chapters that there are. These are prophecies and poetic prophecies and prose, mostly poetic prophecies though, and they alternate between themes of judgment and themes of salvation. As we talked about, there's much in Isaiah that's turning to his own people and saying, you guys are screwing up, and you need to get it right, or this is not going to go well. And there's reasons that he comes in and he says, and if you do, or we need to because, and then he offers these beautiful visions of salvation, of what it will look like if and when God is actually being followed and responded to. So it is not just doom and gloom. That's more Jeremiah that Jared will talk about next week. For us, there's this interplay between the two. So as a breakdown of those 39 chapters, chapter 1 is kind of an introduction, with 2 and 4 being 2 through 4 being examples of this judgment on and the promise to Jerusalem. Remember, one of the overarching themes of Isaiah is this focus on Jerusalem as a really important place, the place that represents but also embodies the presence of God with the people. So these early chapters are some oracles against God's own people. So the book starts out pretty harsh. Chapters 5 to 11 we can trace pretty closely to coming during the Syro-Ephraimite War. So that's when the Syrians and the northern kingdom are united against Judah. And we'll talk in a second about how we can tell that. And again, these poems alternate between the divine judgment that may come if they don't handle this situation well, and the future kingdom of peace and justice. But before we get into that, we're going to talk for a second about Isaiah 6, verses 1 through 9. And this illumination from our St. John's Bible attaches to those chapters. This is the call of Isaiah. If you remember, we talked about in our introduction last week, many of these prophets in their books have a little bit of a story about how they got into this business to begin with, and often how they reluctantly were pulled into, drawn into this work of prophecy. So, I'm going to read 6, 1 through 9. You can look at the illumination there. And it starts, in the year that King Uzziah died, which is very helpful because we know when that was, 738, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, and with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The pivots on the threshold shook, and the voices of those who called, and the house filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me! I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. The seraph touched my mouth with it and said, Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed, and your sin is blotted out. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, Here am I, send me. So just a quick note on some of the images here, if you can see them, and I encourage you to take a look at the Bibles themselves. You'll see sort of up in the gold within the St. John's Bible represents the presence of the divine. Okay, so when you see that, that's what you're looking at. You see also etched around the edges almost sort of these are wings taken from an Assyrian relief of the time of seraphim. So this idea from a museum, the artist took them and made a sort of stamp out of them and has those flying all around here. You see, it may be hard to note here, but you can see sort of at the bottom there's a figure who is Isaiah himself, sort of falling back. The red here being that red coal touching his lips, and sort of this whole sense of the smoke filling, so the divine and the royal purple that come through here mixing together here in the temple on the throne is the God, the King. You've got the words in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek for holy, holy, holy. Our Sanctus becomes taken up from this song from the angels, and then you've got this sense of the lamps that are around, the holy lamps. There are many more details to look at there, but this is one of the most stunning of the images and deals with a very stunning moment in the life of the prophet. So that's how Isaiah gets started. The year that King Uzziah died in 738, and then he begins, and here's an example, maybe one of the lighter examples of what we might hear as a prophecy of judgment from him to his own people, remember, okay? So this is from Isaiah 5. It's from the chapter before, but obviously came after he actually started prophesying. He says, "Let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it and hewed out a wine vat in it. He expected it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes, sour grapes. And now, inhabitants of Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it?" The vineyard being Judah, right? "When I expected it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? And now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will make it a waste. It shall not be pruned or hoed, and it shall be overgrown with briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel," if you didn't get that already, "and the people of Judah are his pleasant planting. He expected justice, but saw bloodshed, righteousness, but heard a cry." And he goes on from there to more specifically decry the injustices that they had let flourish. Does anybody else talk about God's kingdom or God's vision for people in the language of a vineyard that you can remember? Jesus picks up much of this same language, right, and utilizes it. This idea of, and this is again one of the sort of agricultural metaphors Jesus loves to use, but particularly this idea of the vineyard and the people of Israel as the vine. You see that in John. You see that in Paul. I mean, this particular metaphor has life to it, has an afterlife to it. But here you are, he's saying, I'm not going to talk about kingdoms and all that for a second here. I'm going to just pretend there was a vineyard that I helped tend. And the vineyard was not producing what I expected it to produce. What would you have done is essentially what God is saying. I would have cleared it and started over. So that's probably, Isaiah is then saying, put yourself in God's shoes here. If he sees us acting in this way, chances are we're going to get cleared, trampled down. So that's an example of the poetic way in which Isaiah is offering these prophecies of judgment. They go on to be more specific, more intense, more difficult. But the reason being, you guys are not behaving the way that God has intended for us to behave, so it is not going to go well for us. But at the same time, on the other side of this, chapter 7 and then into chapter 9 of Isaiah, we get these promises of salvation. So judgment, salvation. First Isaiah, that's what we're dealing with. So let me read this, and this is actually, I hope, going to help make sense of some of those political machinations we talked about last week. Isaiah 7. "In the days of Ahaz, son of Jotham, son of Uzziah," who we just heard about. So this is Ahaz is Uzziah's grandson. "King of Judah." So when Ahaz was king of Judah, King Rezin of Aram, that's Syria, and King Pekah, son of Remaliah of Israel, so that's Israel and Syria uniting, went up to attack Jerusalem. We heard about that, right? But could not mount an attack against it. When the house of David, that's the kings in the Davidic line, another focal point for Isaiah, heard that Aram had allied itself with Ephraim, another name for Israel, not helpful, but same thing. The heart of Ahaz, the king of Judah, and the heart of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake before the wind. So this is basically outlining the historical context for this next section. So Isaiah's call when King Uzziah died, this Syro-Ephraimite war being outlined here because of the people that are involved. So move forward a couple of verses here. "Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz, saying, 'Ask a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven.' But Ahaz said, 'Well, no, I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test.' Then Isaiah said, "Hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary mortals that you weary my God also? Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child, and shall bear a son, and shall name him Emmanuel." So there's this moment here. Ahaz is the one who's going to come up with the idea of allying with Assyria, right? But he's getting this opportunity, at least in this narrative, to ask God, to trust God for a sign. To say, ask God for help, is what's being said here. And God is saying, he said, ask me for help, and I will do it. And Ahaz says, no, I wouldn't dare. Maybe he already had the plan to ally with Assyria. Maybe he didn't have the faith that it would work. Whatever reason, he says no. And Isaiah is like, you idiot. Here's the sign. And then we get these words that we know so well. Behold, the woman is with child, and she shall bear a son, and shall name him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. God with us. You see how this then echoes forward, that particular line, but coming out of this particular historical context of these political situation of the 700s. Moving on to Isaiah 9, and then we'll talk about the image here for a moment. And so this is Isaiah saying, this is what is coming in our time of salvation. But hear it in the context of the historical time we talked about, the people that are fighting each other, and hear it with the ears we already have, which is these later understandings where Jesus fits in. But there will be no gloom, he says, for those who were in anguish. In the former time, he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, that's the northern kingdom. But in the latter time, he will make glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. So we're talking about a restoration of the whole Holy Land here. And then he says, the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who lived in a land of deep darkness, on them light has shined. You have multiplied the nation. You have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, as people exult when dividing plunder. For the yoke of their burden and the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor, you have broken, as on the day of Midian, which was a story from the Old Testament. For all the boots of the tramping warriors, think of all the war that is going on right now, and all the garments rolled in blood shall be burned as fuel for the fire. For a child has been born for us, a son given to us, authority rests upon his shoulders, and he is named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. His authority shall grow continually, and there shall be endless peace. Could there be anything better when you're living in decades of war? For the throne of David and his kingdom, remember the focus on the Davidic line, he will establish and uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time onwards and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. So that beautiful prophecy, those names that here get spiraled around like on threads of banners and things like that, sort of thrown together here, that great, hallelujah chorus. This is where it's coming from, right? It's coming from this hope within the 700s BC for a ruler to come and restore the fortunes of the people. And it will start as a child that is representative of God being with them, with the people of Judah, with the people of Jerusalem, against all these forces arrayed against it, so that it will restore the beautiful wholeness that maybe never really was, but at least was hoped for within the promised land. Okay? Now the question that we will ask now, and we're going to ask later, and I asked it at the beginning, it's probable that first Isaiah was writing this about the birth of Hezekiah, this new leader, who was coming, Ahaz's son, who seemed to be made of stronger stuff, let's say. And so there was hope there. We'll talk about how that plays out and whether that prophecy can apply to Hezekiah and to others as well based upon the way it goes. But that is sort of the context of this as you hear these words, which we usually hear in a very different context around Christmas, right? So keep that in mind. Take a look at this wonderful illumination here, which does sort of generates that sense of excitement of sort of this pile of names that gets layered onto this individual, and the sort of the party that will create, this sense of lightness, of joy. Think of this contrasted just a few pages later with the dark purple of Isaiah's vision. Sort of this is a lighter vision, a hopeful vision as well. So I commend this to you. That's all we're going to read from 1st Isaiah, but let me tell you a little bit more about what happens in the next parts of Isaiah. 13 to 23 are oracles against some of these enemies, these other nations. So he goes from talking about his people and what they're doing wrong to why the other nations are screwed up. He gets to Isaiah 24 to 27. They call this the Isaiah apocalypse. Things get pretty dark there. There are some scholars out there who think this is an interpolation from another writer of the time because the style and content does diverge somewhat, but it's hard to say for sure. Then 28 to 33 are oracles at the time that Hezekiah stages his revolt against the Assyrians. And if you remember from last week, the way in which Hezekiah tries to do that is to ally with Egypt, another power in the area. And Isaiah spends some time saying, don't do that, bad idea, please don't. Hezekiah tries, Egypt actually rebuffs him, so it doesn't actually happen, but it does. It is a time, again, where Isaiah is pointing to a specific moment in the political history of Israel, which he thinks is bad. 34 and 35 shift to the post-disaster period, much closer in style and content to 2nd Isaiah, which we'll look at in a second. And 35 actually sets up a lot of what you'll hear in chapter 40 when it starts. And then I mentioned last week from 36 to 39, those last three chapters, is actually sort of an interjection of prose, which is borrowed from 2 Kings. So it's a history, prose history, telling in prose the context of that Hezekiah versus the Assyrians reaching out to Egypt, etc. And that obviously does not go well, but that's where 1st Isaiah sort of concludes. It's sort of the stitching. Any questions? I know we don't have a lot of time, but so any particular questions of clarity around 1st Isaiah? Are you guys seeing a little bit about how the story of the history that we went to great pains to try to convey last week relates to the content of the actual prophecies of judgment and salvation in that particular time? Natalie, yeah.
He mentions David.
He does, yes.
Where is David historically at this point? I don't know.
David has long since died at this point.
Okay,
Yeah, so he's in the past. Yeah, but he has established the Davidic line as the sort of the good king, even though we can debate about David's better and worse qualities. Right. His line becomes the line. You know, that's the tutors of the age, right? And so you've got David, and then you've got Solomon, and on and on. And so Ahaz and Hezekiah are sort of in that line of the family tree. So they're coming from there. Good question. All right, let's move on to 2nd Isaiah, because all of a sudden then we jump about 100 years, maybe about 150 almost actually. And the reason we know this, I will tell you in a second, is because the historical context has changed. We are no longer talking about Assyria or the Syrian-Ephraimite alliance in the content of the prophecies. What you're hearing about instead is Babylon. And the history tells us that Babylon rises up, conquers the Assyrians, and so there's a bigger bully on the block, and so that changes the dynamic of things. I won't get into that 150-year period, what happens, but eventually what we get to is the conquering of, the full conquering of Judah and the city of Jerusalem. And not just the conquering of it, but the destruction of it, and then the exile, the diaspora of most of the Jews from that land. So all of a sudden, the situation is different. And as I said last week, the exile, that time from 597 to 539, the lead up to it, the actuality of it, and the recovery from it, is a lot of what the Old Testament is focused on as far as what they're dealing with for people. Once you get out of those old stories from Genesis and Exodus, etc. This is the pivotal, critical moment because they had it, the land, the promise, the covenant, and they lost it. And so it's a question of wrestling with why, how, what can be done about that. It becomes an existential moment for the people of Israel. So all of that is going to be central to the work of the prophets moving through the rest of them, not just Isaiah. We also know that in these prophecies, second Isaiah, speaks of Cyrus the Great, right? And he was a Persian ruler. So we got another bully on the block who's even bigger and badder than the Babylonians. And they've got a guy named Cyrus. And so this second Isaiah pins a lot of hope, we'll see, on that particular Persian ruler, even though there's no pretension that he is actually, and we'll see this, a person of Israel. He is an instrument through which God will work the restoration of the people. You'll see that in chapter 44 and 45. Persia is the new threat to the Babylonians. Because of that particular focus, second Isaiah is probably writing in a very small window between 545 and 539, right at the end of the exile. And they are looking for a savior, right? They're looking for someone to help get them back to where they came from. And they believe Cyrus will allow them to return to their homeland. He will be the instrument through which God will work. And so the prophecies are less judgment and more comfort, hope, encouragement to the people. So it's a different notes are getting hit in these middle chapters. There are some internal strife between the prophet and the people, it appears, and we'll talk about one of the servant songs in a minute. The second Isaiah clearly knew and was dependent on first Isaiah, shares first Isaiah's focus, theological focus on the holiness and the kingship of God, using the idea of the Davidic line, but applies it now less to a ruler than to the people. We are the people who sit at the bottom of this line here. We are going to be restored. God is going to keep God's promises to us. So the style is different, even if some of the ideas are similar. There's more consolation and hope, as I said. It is even more lyrical in its poetry and more reassuring to people that God is still in control, even though there's no evidence to that given the situation they find themselves in. God will bring the people back to their land in another kind of exodus, right? A return, sort of a redo. The history of the people of Israel is full of redos. Even more glorious than the first, though. And a lot of exposition explaining or sort of, pumping us up to say our God is bigger and better than the Babylonian gods, the idols that they have. So the way the chapters break down is that from 40 to 55 is designated as second Isaiah. 40 to 48 are looking for that new ruler and for that rescue and making fun of idols. But that's where you get Isaiah 40, right? Hear these words in that context. Comfort, O comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that she has served her term, that her penalty is paid, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. A voice cries out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God to get home. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill made low. Get you up to a high mountain, O Zion, herald of good tidings. O Jerusalem, herald of good tidings, lift it up, do not fear. Say to the cities of Judah, here is your God. See, the Lord comes with might, and his arm rules for him. His reward is with him, and his recompense before him. He will feed his flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs in his arms, lambs that are all spread out right now, right? And carry them in his bosom and gently lead the mother sheep. Then there's a vision of power. To whom then will you compare me, or who is my equal? Says the Holy One. Lift up your eyes on high and see. Who created these? He who brings out their hosts, the stars, and numbers them, calling them all by name, because he is great in strength, mighty in power, not one is missing. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded from my God? Have you not known? Have you not heard, all of you who are questioning God right now? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Even youths will faint and be weary, and the young will fall exhausted. But those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. I read a long passage from here because it hits a lot of the notes that the rest of the book then goes into, which is comfort, hope, the need to keep the faith, so to speak, here, so that will sustain us in this time of exile, and these lyrically soaring passages of God's power and might. So don't doubt the most powerful creator of the universe. He is the bigger God than the Babylonian God. So you hear that there. It sounds a little different, right, when you don't hear it read as a prelude to the Christmas story, right? It's about these people. Now, could it also be a prelude to the Christmas story? Yes, we're going to talk about that. But this is the idea here of what is happening and why these people need comfort, why they need hope at this time. 44 and 45 is when he talks about Cyrus, though. So I want you to hear this because this becomes an interesting thing played out in, well, even our day. Thus says the Lord your Redeemer, who formed you in the womb. I am the Lord who made all things, who alone stretched out the heavens. More statements of power here. Who by myself spread out the earth. Who frustrates the omens of liars and makes fools of diviners. Who turns back the wise and makes their knowledge foolish. Who confirms the word of his servant and fulfills the prediction of his messengers. Who says to Jerusalem, it shall be inhabited. Jerusalem, you're going to have a city. And the cities of Judah, they shall be rebuilt, and I will raise up their ruins. Who says to the deep, be dry. I will dry up your rivers. Who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall carry out all my purpose. And who says of Jerusalem, it shall be rebuilt, and of the temple, your foundation shall be laid. Continuing into 45, thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped to subdue the nations before him and strip kings of their robes, to open doors before him. For the sake of my servant Jacob and Israel, my chosen, I call you by your name. I surname you, though you do not know me. So you hear how he's talking about Cyrus as an outsider that's being used by God, given this power to come and subdue the people who have created this exile, right? This is an interesting idea that has been interestingly taken up and used theologically for Christians and modern people of faith for a long time. The use of someone who is hard to make an argument that they're in the line of the faithful people, but who also have a role to play in the restoration of those people. And the triumphalism of that and the combativeness of it is something we can see in modern discourse today about the ways in which certain rulers or leaders are being used by God to restore the people. Now, there are, I would say, some interpretive stretches being made in that based upon the actual context and what's being written here. But it is, you should know, it's certainly something that is within the public narrative, the public discourse at this time. Okay? So that's another reason to read those passages. There's also a section in 2nd Isaiah as we move out of 48 and into 50 to 56 that talks about the servant songs. He's not talking about Cyrus anymore. We don't know who he's talking about. There are these stories or these poems about some deep suffering from the one who is trying to help the people. And so I'm not going to read all of this, but Isaiah 53, He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity. And as one from whom others hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him of no account. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. Yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. When do we hear that? Holy Week, Good Friday, right? That's where we hear that passage. There's much debate about who exactly is being talked about here, but the leading school is that this is perhaps Isaiah talking about himself as the prophet, trying to give these words of comfort, and yes, sometimes judgment, and that he has suffered dearly for that. Also leaving open the possibility that there's someone else who will play that same role in 500 years. So that's the servant songs. Here's a beautiful illumination. In the interest of time, we don't have a lot of time to go into it here, but you should spend some time with it. It talks about these verses of the suffering servant and how those are represented within perhaps some of the modern age, this idea of caging and the people who are suffering in this world. So take a look at that for a second. But then at the end of 2nd Isaiah, if you move to 55, you get hope. You get beautiful songs of hope. Canticle 11 in our prayer book comes out of Isaiah 55. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake their way and the unrighteous their thoughts. Let them return to the Lord, that he may have mercy on them, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon. So again, this promise, this hope, which is central to 2nd Isaiah, this desire to have the fullness of life to which Israel is called brought back when they return. But when they do return, things don't go exactly as they have planned, and that's what 3rd Isaiah takes up. If 1st Isaiah is talking about judgment and salvation, prophecies of what is to come if you keep on this road, or what could happen if you changed your ways. If Isaiah 2 is about hope and encouragement for the future, stay the course, keep the faith, Isaiah 3 is about justice, about ways in which the people are behaving once they have been brought back, because Cyrus does win and allows the people to return, and they begin to rebuild Jerusalem. They have returned home and are living in the land of Judah, and they're already rebuilding the temple, you can tell from what Isaiah is talking about, which was done between 520 and 515 BC, so that's the short window there. But life remains harsh, and that people that have come back are practicing economic and other forms of oppression. There are pagan rituals resurfacing, and there are deep social, religious divisions within the Judean community. They have been sort of traumatized, and they're living out that trauma as they come back into community together. So 3rd Isaiah spends some good amount of time condemning these oppressors for their oppressive behavior, and these people who are attempting a certain form of syncretism, which would be taking some of what they picked up from their Babylonian time and trying to bring it back and weaving it together with their understanding of the monotheistic understanding of the one God. It's still foretelling, though, a full deliverance from God, and this is where 3rd Isaiah leaves open the end of this full restoration. It has not yet come. Even when they got to go back, it's not quite right yet. And so when you get to the end of 3rd Isaiah, there are some beautiful passages about what is to come, but is not yet here, which is one of the reasons Isaiah becomes the book that New Testament writers are looking to when they are looking to pull forward the story into their context 500 years later. There's talk about the wealth and the remaining exiles coming back. Not everybody has come back. It's like, post-COVID, we sort of came back to church and only a few people were there. We're like, are they going to come? Now they have. That's good, but it took some time for that to happen. And their shame and sorrow will be, but has not yet been turned into joy and prosperity. That promise kind of gets pushed out, but they're still telling it. There's some future intervention from God will come, and through that intervention, perform judgment and provide salvation of the people. The people will be purified, and Jerusalem will become the religious center of the world. Still similar to 2nd Isaiah in its writing, so if it wasn't actual 2nd Isaiah, it was a close disciple of his, and it shares very deeply the concern with the destiny of Jerusalem. I'm going to read just briefly, but if you want to look at home at Isaiah 58, Isaiah 61, these are some of the passages where you see the outline, where you see their rebellion, their continued disobedience outlined. Isaiah 58, shout out, do not hold back. Lift up your voice like a trumpet. Announce to my people their rebellion, to the house of Jacob their sins. As if they were a nation that practiced righteousness and did not forsake the ordinance of their God, they ask of me righteous judgments. They delight to draw near to God. But then he goes in to say, look, is this the fast that I choose, the day where you just come begging to me? Is it to bow down your head like a bulrush and to lie in sackcloth and ashes? Is not this, he says, the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? That's where you get that context, is saying, if you really want God to come, stop spending all day rolling around on the ground saying, woe is me. Let's get people actually the food they need. Let's get them the clothes they need. Let's get them the homes they need. And this is echoed in Isaiah 61, which you will hear next week, echoed by Jesus when he stands in the temple and is given the scroll of Isaiah to read from. And he rolls it out and it says, and he found. It wasn't like he just opened it up and saw what was there. It say he looked for this passage. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to release the prisoners, to grant liberty to the captives, to release the prisoners, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, to comfort all who mourn. That is the role that Jesus is in that scene, I would say, claiming for himself. But also the role that Isaiah, 3rd Isaiah here, is claiming for the people as they come back to Jerusalem. And then he spends time in Isaiah 62 talking about how all the people are going to come back and Jerusalem, Zion, will become the center of the world again. That meeting place of heaven and earth. And you hear in Isaiah 65 language like this, for I am about to create new heavens and a new earth. The former things shall not be remembered or come to mind. And then that chapter closes out with a reprisal of the peaceable kingdom. The wolf and the lamb shall feed together. The lion shall eat straw like the ox, but the serpent, its food, shall be dust. They shall not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain, says the Lord. Which is borrowing some imagery and language from 1st Isaiah. So when we talk about 2nd and 3rd Isaiah knowing that who came before them, that's one piece of evidence for that. This idea of the peaceable kingdom that 1st Isaiah is prophesying still is needed by the time we get to a few hundred years later from that time. And that's where we leave it, 65, 66. This roller coaster that Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, charts between the fortunes of the people. They are in power. They have ostensibly what they want and need, but it's not going right. They need to do it better. Judgment, salvation, Isaiah 1. Isaiah 2, 150 years later, things have gone badly. They're in exile, need comfort and encouragement and hope for the people. They do come back not too long after that 2nd Isaiah is written, and yet they're not doing it right. So they need that idea of justice to be re-centered for them as a people, so that they can, hopefully, create that kingdom that they are called to and had been called to through these different points of history. Now, whether they do or not, there's this fascinating gap of about 500 years from the end of the latest Old Testament book to the beginning of the New Testament books, about year 0. But it's clear when Jesus shows up, there's a new bully on the block, right, of Rome. But there are still massive questions of the way in which the religious authorities are behaving and keeping the laws, right? The questions of Jesus there to fulfill the law and actually do what God has said he wants his people to do, which is very much what Isaiah is calling them back to. And then him being the anointed ruler, the one in the Davidic line of kings, and the focal point on Jerusalem, this new heavens and new earth. You're going to hear that in Revelation, right? Same language. All of that borrowed up out of Isaiah, which is why it is to me, he's the prophet. There's some other good stuff in here that you'll get to, but this is really the great stuff. This is the closing page of his book in the St. John's Bible. You see those Assyrian seraph wings there overlaid against the sort of outline of the temple there as well. So it leaves some things unresolved and also provides us with some wonderful images, language, ideas for the future that then get transferred on, okay? And I'm sorry that we're pressing up past time here because I'd love to hear more of what you think about this, but how this is going to work is we're going to move from Isaiah, but don't lose Isaiah because we're going to go through the rest of the prophets, but then in Lent, in March and into the beginning of April, Rabbi Panitz is going to be here to talk to us about what was Judaism like by the time Jesus came around, which is going to fill in what they call this Second Temple period, I think. This time when they have come back and they have to rebuild, create a second temple. So Second Temple Judaism emerges around that time over the course of a few hundred years, and that then provides the context for Jesus to come into. So we're going to try to fill in that gap a little bit. In the meantime, we're going to spend another few weeks with the prophets and thinking about them as well. All right. You guys got a general outline of how Isaiah works and what he's all about? There's so much good stuff in there that we didn't get to touch. I would encourage you, like I did last week, to read it. And hopefully this will give you a little bit of a sort of basic understanding as you do to try to appreciate where these different prophecies are coming from. All right? So thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. We will pick up with Jeremiah next week. Jared will take us through that. And in the meantime, we are looking forward to having a wonderful morning of church with you. So thank you very much. We'll see you in a few minutes.